We'll talk about this project coming up. This is our second project, right? So this is technically module 3. So I haven't quite released the curriculum for this yet. I'll probably do that today, right after we get off this meeting. But just know that this data set basically is going to be, we're going to give you a database, a SQLite database. You'll get the data through basically querying it through SQL, and then actually taking that data and basically performing a hypothesis test. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and show you guys what this will be. Let me go ahead and share. Okay, so you guys should all be able to see my screen now, and I lost everyone. Okay, so this is right here is the project. This is what you'll see once it's launched or deployed on the curriculum. Again, module 3 final project. Basically, I'm kind of just skipping over, and obviously you guys will read this through yourself. We give you a database. If I actually go to the GitHub repo itself, you'll see that in there is going to be not a CSV, but actually a SQLite database. So if you remember back, like when we did SQL and everything like that, that's what we're going to be looking at. And the other part in here, oh, actually that's the main part. It's just, this is the database. So one thing I suggest to you all, I think I said this before, you can technically just fork this yourself, like just clicking fork on GitHub. One thing I would suggest, and this is just my personal preference, is you make this your own repo, your own project. Versus forking it. So just kind of remind you guys how to do that. You click up here and click new repository, right? And once you do that, you can create a new repository. You can call it, for example, you know, like hypothesis testing project, or, you know, whatever you want to call it. For example, a lot of people call it like the Northwind because it's the Northwind data. So you might call it like Northwind project and all that. And you create that part. And then once you have this created, so for example, I'll just show you guys what this would look like. So Northwind project, public. I might add a git ignore. I always add a git ignore because it's good practice. This ignores all the junk data, like junk files that are created from like IPNB checkpoints and stuff like that. I also initialize with a README. And again, READMEs are really about describing about the project. So this is kind of like, I just start this off with a blank one. You don't have to add a license if you don't want to. Make sure it's public. You can put a description if you want, but it doesn't really matter. So I create that repo. And so once this repo is created, you'll see there's a couple files in here. Oh, I guess I didn't initialize with a README. There would normally be a README file here. So this is your own data set now. And so one thing you would do now is just you go ahead and clone this like you normally would, just like you would normally clone your any other project, right? So once you have that, you do in your terminal. And then one thing I would say is just make sure for this project in particular, make sure you upload this data set right here. So download this specific file. You can just simply click on this, for example, and just click download, and it'll download the file, and then you can drag it into your repository or upload it and whatnot. If you have issues with that, let me know, because Git can sometimes be kind of trouble to try to figure out what to do on those errors and such. But that's my suggestion, is make your own repo, okay? And make sure you have the SQLite database. But then once you have that SQLite database in there, to actually do the project, what are you going to do? So this is basically, it's called our Northwind Database. I can't remember where they actually retrieved this database. Oh, here. So it's a free and open source data set created by Microsoft containing data from a fictional company. So I think this is direct from here. You can probably look at Northwind Database if you want. It's from a fictional company. You can see here, this is our schema going through here. The product, there's orders, there's employees, customers. So you can kind of explore this, see what's in there, see how it's related. You can mostly think of this as a company that might have multiple stations, might be having multiple different customers. They're selling different products. That's what this, for example, your product and your orders and all this stuff. So this is what you're kind of going through. And the main thing that you want to do here is that you can imagine talking to this business, and what they want, they ask you basically, they want you to research, does discount amount have a statistically significant effect on the quantity of a product in an order? If so, at what levels? So basically they're saying, hey, do discounts matter? Like, does it actually have an effect? And if it does have an effect, what levels does it actually matter? Like which things, like what discount should we be giving? And this is based off their data. So that's what you're gonna basically be testing. And so it sounds like a relatively simple like question. You're like, oh, do discounts matter? And then what discount should we give? This is where you have to decide, obviously, how you're gonna proceed forward. a t-test, multiple comparisons, all that stuff. And then in addition to doing that hypothesis, we want you to come up with at least 3 other hypotheses on your own. So like things that would be relevant to the maybe the company or the business, right? Is that you want to have something that, what's it called? Like what's a question we might ask a business, or what might be something that might be relevant to a business that's selling products and stuff? What's something that might concern them or they might know more about?
Maybe like location, like which regions sell more for advertising and stuff.
Perfect. Yeah. So what regions are like, what regions are doing well, which regions are not doing very well? They might want to say, hey, do we need to advertise more here? Or say, oh, something's doing really well in this region. We need to copy and emulate whatever's going here. Those are things like, that would be maybe another hypothesis. It's like, oh, what regions do well? So there's a whole bunch of things you can kind of do. And this is actually a really good practice in the sense too, because sometimes a business or a stakeholder will come up to you and say, oh, we want to know these things, but like, that's not the whole picture. So for example, getting a discount, like, oh, what discounts we have, but you find out all the discounts are being done in a certain region. You're like, hey, like this actually really matters to you guys. You want to investigate what regions more than just a discount. So this is where like being a proactive data scientist can be really useful. 1, it shows that you know what you're doing. 2 is that it can save you time in the end, because coming back with a result of exactly what they said, and you come back and say, oh, here's our result. And they're like, oh, but we really want to know about this. You're like, oh, well, I didn't look at that. Let me go back to the drawing board and investigate that. So it's a good practice. And so really what you're going to have here then is going to be essentially 4 different hypotheses. This main one, which I guess is really 2, and then basically come up with 3 other ones for your own. Okay. There's kind of advice in here: state your null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis. This is always really important for any time you're doing statistical tests, is state at the very beginning, what is your null and what is your alternative? That way it's very clear when you reject it and whatnot. Let's see here, anything else? But other than that, that's kind of the main thing. Oh, I guess one tail and two tail, but that's really determined on your hypothesis. So remember, one tail is like if you're saying if it's greater than or less than specifically, or a two tail test is like basically saying, is there a difference between the two? So a classic, for example, for like a test would be like, oh, if I put a red button on the website versus a blue button on the website, will they perform differently? You don't know which one's going to perform better. You just care about, do they perform differently or does it not matter at all? So that's where you would use a two tail test, for example. If you had a specific change, you probably would do a one tail. For the record, just I'm going to throw this in there, is that for the most part, you probably will do more one-tail tests in a business, because usually a business is making a single change and then, did that change do better? They don't care if it did the same or did worse. They just care, did it do better? And if it didn't do better, they're like, okay, cool, we won't use that anymore. For the most part, it can obviously be different. So that's kind of like, that's actually the big project. Like, it's not too complicated, I think, in the sense of like what you need to do. It's a lot of freedom for what you want, right? Everyone's going to have a slightly different way of approaching it. So yeah, so any questions on what that project is, or what kind of to like just overall, obviously you guys haven't explored it and everything like that and tried it out, but any immediate questions or concerns that come to mind?
Can we use the ANOVA test as well, instead of just doing the one tail and two tail test?
Yeah. So an ANOVA test, you can definitely do that. Remember though, ANOVA is going to give you a result. I mean, ANOVA test in general will tell you, is there a significant difference between what you're testing out? I realize, am I recording? Yes, okay, good, sorry. I didn't see my little dot that showed up at first. But ANOVA will basically say, is there a difference, not which one is the difference. So be kind of aware of this. The curriculum, I kind of mentioned this before, I maybe didn't do the best job explaining it. The curriculum uses stats models, which actually will do multiple comparisons between each one and will tell you the significance between each part. But note that ANOVA by itself, if you look up, for example, ANOVA one way, or I should say two way, but like if you do an ANOVA, you would see it's just giving you a statistic, is it different from each other? And then from that point, if it is significant, you might actually go explore, for example, multiple t-tests, or do something like stats models where it's doing multiple comparisons or comparing it to, again, I'm starting to get into parts where we haven't talked about but you might do like a model, for example, like a linear regression model, and look at interactions and stuff like that, because that could be a factor. But we haven't talked about how we would do interactions for linear regression. So just kind of be aware of that. But yeah, you're definitely welcome to use other tests. If you find, for example, like think of this as the real world. If you find, like, if you go do some research because you're like, hey, I want to know more about hypothesis testing, and you find a really good hypothesis test that's relevant to the specific thing you're looking for, you're free to use that. Like, there's not like a reason like, oh, you can only use the t-test, the Welsh's test that we gave you. Like, this is like your project. This is your way to own it. So feel free to do that too. Okay. Good question.
Thank you.
No problem. Any other immediate questions or concerns that you guys might be thinking of right now?
When are you going to release the project? I don't think I have access to it yet.
Yes, I think you just missed that, Thomas. When I started, I haven't released it yet. I'll be releasing it later today. So probably right after this meeting. So,
okay, cool.
Cool. All right, awesome. All right, so general about this project, remember there's 4 parts. There's the Jupyter Notebook, the blog posts, and then, so the Jupyter Notebook's your technical part. The blog post is, you writing about it. I have some advice for that too. And then, sorry, this is the executive summary, your non-technical presentation. So that, remember, is like basically summarizing it to a non-technical audience. You don't want to be using, oh, I did an ANOVA test, and the found significant value of P of 0.0325, which means we can reject the null hypothesis. Like, nah, like you can mention we did like a test, but like the main part is to say, hey, like this is better, do this. That's kind of what you're coming at it. And if someone says like, how do you know? Then you can start throwing technical jargon at them if they really want it. Okay. So I have some advice for that too. And then the 4th thing, which is, I don't think it's on here. I need to make sure there's a change on here. But the 4th thing is your video recording. And again, I would say don't stress out about the video recording. Like, I don't know about you guys, but like if I ever do a video recording like that, besides like things like this, I get kind of freaked out, like, oh, I need to record it over and over again. Think of it like as like a good practice. So you practice a few times, your presentation, you're doing pretty well. It's like, okay, cool. And then go ahead and do the recording. If you mess up in the recording, it's not a big deal. I specifically won't be like looking for like, how well you do in your recording. I'm really going to look at it during our actual assessment on our one-on-one assessment. Okay. Cool. So speaking of all that stuff, I have some general advice for you guys. And so forgive me on this. I was actually going to do this a little bit more. Oh, wait a second. Is this right? This is, okay. So, so I have some advice. So the first thing is basically, this is not the right one. There it is. Okay. I had edits on there. I'm all messy.
Victor, do we also have like a presentation again, like a non-technical?
That's right.
Okay.
And that's where I think in here, they call it an executive summary PowerPoint presentation.
Oh, yeah.
Presentation. Yeah. But basically you're to the non-technical audience. And that's true for all of your projects, including Capstone, those 4 parts. Okay. So kind of going through the requirements. So you'll have your notebook, your presentation, like Tara had just mentioned, your video, and then your blog. Okay. So those are all the parts that are required. Note that you need to turn this in through Learn before our one-on-one. So if you schedule a one-on-one, let's say it's on that Tuesday, make sure it's turned in on Learn before we actually meet. If you have trouble, or if you're like, hey, like, what about this? Message me ahead of time and say, hey, I'm having trouble with this, or, oh, I forgot to put this in here. It also helps me out so that I can look at it ahead of time, so you don't have to, if there's something major, I can let you know. For the most part, when I think we talked about this before, because our second project, is that if there is something like, if you have to redo something or change something up, I'll try to let you know as quickly as possible, so you don't have to like redo the whole thing and do another assessment. So just remember, you have to have all 4 of those parts before I can actually pass you. All right. Cool. All right. So the first part. So here's some advice. These are things I probably have already said at some level at some point from last project, but I kind of wrote them down that way you guys can kind of see this. But basically, your notebook, your technical part, keep it clean and organized. Right. Oops. I realize this is from another project. You don't need to worry about the starter notebook. Oh wait, did I? Sorry, everyone. I think I might have jumped around when I was writing this up. Yeah, okay. It's been a long day, everyone. So this general advice, yes, okay. So for the notebook, I'm minimizing this so I can read it easier. All right, so for the notebook itself, keep it clean and organized, use functions, right? So if as much as possible, especially, for example, if you're doing like a specific set of actions, especially for statistics, you're doing like, oh, I'm plotting out the points, I'm doing, you know, a t-test, I'm comparing it, you know, making see if it's significant. If you're doing the same thing over and over again, it might make sense to make a function. Note that not every time, just because you have to do something over and over again, doesn't necessarily mean you should make a function, but it can help clean up your code if you're doing that same part. And so if you do use a function, though, make sure you comment and document it. So using a doc string, which is the first string in the function, putting in comments to explain your code. Kind of make a joke here. It's a common day, keep the debugging sessions at bay, because so many times I've done this myself is I will write code and I will forget what it did like literally the next day. I'm like, I don't remember what's going on. So this is where comments can be really useful. I already talked to a few people about like how I write specific comments. Sometimes what I'll do is I won't write any code at first. What I'll do first is literally just write comments and say, okay, I'm going to put Python so it gets notified. Say, okay, I'm going to say, okay, you know, read in data. And then I'll just get the next comment, you know, like drop unneeded comments. You know, and then later on, like they say, oh wait, I need to undrop unneeded comments or columns. And then I say like, oh, like ID is improper, improperly read. Oops. Make it a string. So I might do something like this. And so this kind of helps me kind of like mentally go through my code as I'm going through. So as you notice, I haven't written any code. And this way I can just go look at this stuff. Oops. Actually, no, mine didn't work. But I'll mentally go through my code itself right here. And I'll say, okay, like this is how I can proceed forward. And then what's really cool is when I actually write in my stuff, for example, I give like PD, you know, read CSV. Oops. Ah. Yeah. I might read my file, for example. So like, you know, like file.csv. So like, I'll actually write this here. I'll like keep in some of these comments. So like, especially if they're needed. If it's really obvious, for example, if I'm reading in the data, I might just delete this afterwards. But like, for example, it's like, oh, improperly read, make it a string. It's like, oh, I might keep that in there or expand my comment on there. And what's nice about that is it documents my code automatically and it helps like lead me into what I'm doing. This is a personal style. Obviously, not everyone codes like this. You don't have to code like this. This is just something that I find particularly useful, and you might find it useful too. So anyway, making these kind of like, you know, common kind of instructions can be really helpful. Use Markdown. I mentioned this before, is use Markdown to explain and summarize what your code is doing. So it's not explaining your code. It's like saying what you're trying to do, and then your code actually does it. That's kind of what your Markdown does. Your comments are in the code are specifically talking about how your code is proceeding forward, like what your code is actually doing. Okay. Any questions in general about this? No? Okay, cool. So again, things with your notebook, narratives are a good thing. People, humans, we tend to have a good, narratives really strike home with us. The reader should process, hey, stop it. That really should, it helps the reader like focus their thought process, make sure they can read it from top to bottom and understand what's going on. The way I can say this is that you don't necessarily have to make your notebook literally the way you proceeded for it. Your notebook is for any reader to understand the thought process going through. So you might have a bunch of tasks going back and forth, changing things, editing things, removing things, commenting out things. That shouldn't have to be in your notebook. Really what it is about what is the things that you found that actually work well, and say, okay, keep those in there. If you find a mistake, or like if you find something like, oh, I made this part, you don't need to keep it in there unless it's something relevant. It's like, oh, I was exploring this way and I found this thing. You can kind of move that around. You can keep that as like, oh, I found this interesting aspect of the, what's it called? Of the of the data. And then you might say, okay, let me go ahead when I do the narrative is address that first. Even though like in reality, like you had to explore first before you found that. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. It's kind of like you already know the answer, so you're kind of saying it ahead of time. You can do that too. Okay. And then just know when you're actually going through this conversation or the notebook, it's more of a conversation with a data-minded person. It's your audience, right? Your audience is just one person. You can imagine basically you're talking to a data team member or a data manager. They're familiar with data, they're familiar with data science, they're familiar with tools. You don't have to say, oh, I'm importing libraries. We all know what imports are. You don't have to say we're importing libraries, right? You can kind of go into it. So one good aspect is to literally just start talking about the data itself and say, okay, like I started looking at the data. This is kind of what the data is. This is how big it is. These are things I'm going to explore. That can usually help people or would be a good thing if you're talking to a data team member. And again, it's more of a conversation than a presentation itself. Okay. So any general questions on this notebook aspect? Cool, sound good? All right, so again, this is our like second project, so it's not a big deal. Sorry, can you guys hear my dog? Like whine a little bit? Okay, hold on, let me let her help. So sorry, everyone. I think she hasn't been, well, she threw up earlier today. Not that you guys really care. Anyway, so notebook. So notebook going through it, presentation, as you guys probably read at this point when I'm like away. Keep it short. 5 minutes is what the presentation is. And this is just a good advice. Like whenever someone says, oh, I want you to do a 5-minute presentation, 10-minute presentation, don't go too long. Because if you go too long, one is that people are going to get kind of like bored in the sense that like, they're like, hey, you said it was 10 minutes, but it's going on to 15 minutes. Like, we got to go kind of thing. And they'll just stop listening to you, even though it's super important. So be aware of that. So 8 minutes, I'd say it's like the high end. Okay, so 8 minutes is kind of like, that's as really as far as you can go. 10 minutes is complete maximum. If you go past 10 minutes, I might have to actually like kind of stop you, say, hey, like we need to trim it down and stuff like this, and maybe kind of reassess of how you're going to do the presentation. But just be aware of that for timing. And that's where practice helps. So this is where also the recording is useful to do ahead of time, because then you actually see how long you did it. Like sometimes you practice things out loud or even in your head and it feels very short. And then when you actually look at it, you're like, oh, well, that was a lot longer than I thought it was going to be. So just kind of be aware of that. I'd say be careful being too short. Most time people aren't too short. As long as you're giving the relevant information, I don't think people get like on the short end, but that can be an issue too. So just be aware. One thing I'm going to emphasize is, remember, you are the subject of the presentation, not your slides. So this is something I kind of emphasize a lot with when you're making your slide deck, is that your slide should not be the pure source of information. You are the source of this information. You are the one giving the context. You're the one basically giving all those parts. Your slide should emphasize whatever you're saying. Hopefully that makes sense. So if someone can completely like ignore what you're saying and just look at your slides, in a lot of ways, you aren't needed for this presentation. And that's a different kind of thing. That sometimes you might write a paper and people can read that whole thing and not really have you explain it. But in a presentation, that's not the point. The point is for you to guide that emphasis. So one thing I would kind of avoid is sentences. Like if anyone ever talks about a lot of sentences and stuff like that, you're basically just reading if you ever like, this is like back in high school or middle school, I used to tell students, like, never like read your slides. If you're looking at your slide to read it, it means that you have too much information on it, right? Really what you should do is that should summarize your point. So when they look at that thing on their presentation, they say, oh, this is what I should get out of whatever, Victor is talking about, right? Less is more. Don't give too much information. And I say don't give too much information in the sense that like don't overload with people. So not too many words, not too many sentences. Also, this is true with visualizations. Sometimes, as data science, again, more analytical kind of people, as you guys probably are, being in data science, you probably like seeing those numbers, you like seeing those graphs, you like seeing the dense information. That's not who you're aiming towards. You're aiming towards people who are at a high, like I have to say is that pretend you're talking to someone with like a high schoolers. from mathematic background. And it's not to say like, oh, these people are dumber or like they don't know anything. It's basically to help you make sure that you concisely put it in. Like, how would you talk to someone who only has a high school background in mathematics? Like, don't throw a bunch of p-values in there. Don't throw a bunch of even like graphs. Like if you have a linear regression, for example, you don't want to put all the different points on there and like different aspects. I've done this, like, you know, I've done this part, and I could tell afterwards, I'm like, oh, that was a mistake, because people are like, what's going on? And they'll start asking questions about like the equation, where really I don't care about them about the equation. I want them to know about the results itself. So be aware of that. Okay. So this one I put a little like, you know, plugins that say, oh, my little general rules. These are kind of like my generic parts that say, these are my personal preferences. You do not have to follow them. You can completely disagree with me. I won't like, you know, say, oh, well, you're wrong or whatever. These are just things that I think that are really useful and I found for my own presentation stuff. And just the way I've been taught kind of, and I find it's really useful, okay? So one is that each slide contains a single thought or concept, okay? This doesn't necessarily mean like, what's it called? It doesn't necessarily mean like, you know, one result. It just means one concept. So one thing you might do is introduce the concept or the result. Say, oh, we found, you know, let's say like discounts at 25% are better. That would be like my slide. And I say, okay, what we found is that we've compared a bunch of, and I'll say verbally, we've compared a bunch of different discounts levels, you know, 5%, 10%, 15%, 25%, 30%. And we found 25% to be the most effective one that actually makes us revenue. And then I might move on to the next slide. Then I might go into more detail about that specific aspect and saying, you know, how much more revenue, you know, or, you know, how much more sales did we have or whatever. That's kind of what I mean by like a single concept. And this is where I say more slides are fine. I think at some point, I don't even know if the curriculum says it. Some people get to quote me, it's like, oh, 12 slides is as much as you should have. I'm like, no, you can have more than that. But just be aware is that you shouldn't also be like rapid fire going through the slides, like going through like 50 slides in like under a minute. Obviously that's ridiculous. But don't feel like you have to have all the information all on one slide. If it's all on one slide, you can split that up. You can kind of go through it. If you're only on a slide for 15 seconds, that is okay. However, if you're going through 15 seconds and you have people, for example, in a presentation say, oh, can you go back? Or they're writing down things furiously, it means that you have too much information on there. And so you either need to spend more time on the slide, or what I prefer to do is I will split up the slide into smaller chunks. So there's not as much information on that one slide. Okay, because again, in my opinion, it should be about you, not about the slide itself. Again, it summarizes what you say and emphasizes your points. Again, it's focusing on you delivering that content, okay? No more than 3 bullets per slide. Again, this is an arbitrary number, but I feel like it's a good rule of thumb. 3 bullet points is probably the most I would put down. 4, in my opinion, is like, okay, you're starting to get to the level of like, that's too much. Maybe you need to start splitting it up. If you have like 5 bullet points, that to me screams to say that needs to be separate slides. These are too much important information. If you need, like, what I usually have is when I tell people this, like, oh, you have too many bullet points, to say, well, each one of these are important. I'm like, if that's true, make it its own slide, because then each one is important. If you have 5 bullet points and you're like, and I say, oh, you need to get rid of some, and you say, okay, let me get rid of those parts, then that means they weren't really important to begin with. So that's kind of like how you can give a good idea. Usually you want to keep those bullet points when they're really related to each other. So I'm thinking like 2 bullet points, maybe 3 bullet points. Again, if you find people like, you know, asking to go back or writing furiously, it's probably not a good idea. Also speaking to like the next part, using sentence fragments, if you're doing a bullet point, don't write a sentence. There's no need to. They know those things are related. You don't need to write a full sentence unless there's something very specific you need to talk about. You probably can summarize those bullet points into sentence fragments, okay? And so a sentence fragment, again, like it's something that's being emphasized. When the main topic isn't being emphasized, I noticed that the sentence grow larger. It's like, because it's almost like you're trying to guide people into the right main topic. And if it's not being the main focus, I think people just end to write sentences to try to get them into that focus. So this kind of helps you kind of mentally say, well, okay, if I'm writing this long sentence, what am I trying to achieve? And it's like, okay, I'm trying to get people to focus on the main topic. Let me reorganize this a certain way. Exceptions, I kind of put in here, and I'm sure there's many others you can think of, but like a formal definition, right? If there's some definition that we need to define and it needs to be very formal, especially in mathematics, you might do something like a full sentence. Obviously quotes, like, you know, you don't want to misquote someone or something because you summarized it too much. But for the most part, I don't think you ever really need full sentences because you're talking. You don't need to basically have a full sentence, because then someone has to read it all. Okay, cool. Any questions on any of these parts I've said so far? All right, hopefully you guys are all agreeing with me. And then visuals and pictures. A visual shouldn't be complicated. Okay, it's kind of like a big sentence. There should only be like 3 elements at most, kind of like in a visual. You don't want a bunch of those scatter points. It's cool, like as data scientists, you see like, you know, some graph and it's got a bunch of data points. It's almost never the point where you actually need to care about seeing all those points to someone who's non-technical. Usually you can summarize that with a single shape, like a line or a bar or, you know, a distribution. Even distribution might be on the edge of what is too technical. And don't just stick a visualization. I've seen this a lot. People do a visualization on their slide and never talk about it. And it's like, you need to say, like, if it's important enough to show on your slide, you need to walk someone through and say, this is the part that's important, either highlight it or at least reference, oh, this is a graph that shows, you know, discounts are really useful or discounts are not very useful or whatever you're going to say. But don't just stick a graph on there and never adjust it. It's kind of like, it's like having a big old bullet point that you never say anything, or a title that you never like address. It's like, well, why did you show me this? So that's kind of the key part. Again, pictures can give high density of information. Sometimes a picture is better than just you writing out bullet points. But in the case, if you do a picture instead of bullet points, you need to explain it, right? You need to say what are the things that they should be taking away from it. Also, sometimes it might be if you take out too much information and you don't emphasize those bullet points, maybe that's something you need to consider too, maybe multiple slides or readjusting your presentation. Okay, so those are kind of like my general kind of like rules and stuff like that. And usually I find really great presentations that I find that are engaging and informative usually follow these general rules. And of course, you can break them if you want. If you say, you know what, I'm gonna write a sentence because, forget you, Victor, like I want sentences, that's perfectly fine. Like I'm not gonna like hold it against you. Okay, cool. So any questions on that then? All right, so last couple things, the video, don't worry about the video, just practice, okay? And the blog, so a couple of suggestions I have for the blog is it should really focus on one aspect of the project. Don't try to do a huge long blog of like, well, one is like, you know, you could try to write this whole long thing. That's not really what we're asking. But if you do try to make it within that time, like or within a number of words, what's going to happen is that you're going to leave out a whole bunch of stuff and it's going to feel very watered down. It's going to feel like I'm going to read, like someone's going to read that blog and it'll just be like, okay, cool. Like, that's cool that you did it. Like, you know, and honestly, you guys are doing a great job and everything, but it's like, someone's gonna read that and they're like, I don't really know what I'm supposed to get out of this. So one suggestion I have is focus on some technical aspect. This is different from, I think, what is suggested in the actual part. I think it says in the blog post to say, oh, you should write about this specific process. In my opinion, you don't have to do that. If you feel like really motivated, like, yes, like I know exactly how to write this story and it's gonna be an amazing thing, go for it. But if you're not really sure, focus on one aspect of like technical aspect. You can talk about like, you know, ANOVA, or you can talk about, you know, t-tests, or you can talk about, you know, collecting the data, you know, for example, like using SQL, you know, like how are you using SQL to combine these parts, or your visualization, that's perfectly fine. Include code snippets. So if you say like, oh, I coded this part, show a little code snippet. If you are talking about something and you're saying how things are different, show that visualization, you know, use the visualizations that you would use to actually see if something's useful or not. These are just help engaging and also show that you not just know how to explain it, but you can also communicate those ideas. That's really part of what the blog post is. And a couple of things too. I know a couple of people already from last project posted their thing on Medium. I personally like Medium a lot. You know, you're welcome to do whatever you want. One good thing about Medium is that that tends to be where a lot of data scientists tend to post. Of course, some people have their own website, which is perfectly fine too. We actually had a few students, not necessarily from this cohort, but who have written some blogs and they've actually gotten featured onto, what's it called, on Medium, like Towards Data Science and a couple other ones. Like I think one was like The Startup. So like, it's kind of cool is if you do post on Medium, it's possible, you know, it can get picked up from someone else and stuff like that. And plus, you know, I think it's a good community in that sense of like, you know, if you're not familiar with Medium, you can clap if you like enjoy a post or whatever. Feel free to share it with each other and kind of like give each other's advice and, you know, all that stuff. And I know some people have already done that, but anyway, that's one suggestion I would have. Okay. And this stuff is not relevant to us. This is from a different project, so just ignore that. So yeah, any questions then about this general advice about the project? Is our second one, so hopefully nothing sounds new to you guys or unfamiliar. Cool. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and I'll stop recording.